G7 finance ministers are gathering this week to discuss the looming threat of a Strait of Hormuz closure. You clicked because you want to know if their warnings about economic collapse hold any real weight against military reality. The problem is that standard diplomatic playbooks assume crises can be solved through consensus and coordinated pressure. What you will discover by watching is why those very mechanisms are structurally incapable of stopping an asymmetric adversary from shutting down the world's most critical energy artery. When we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we usually imagine a dramatic naval blockade or a sudden military escalation. But the reality of how this choke point functions is far more subtle and deeply embedded in global logistics architecture. The G7 relies on synchronized decision-making protocols that require high levels of communication and agreement among member states before any action can be taken. This model works well for trade disputes or tariff negotiations where timescales are measured in months or years. It fails catastrophically when facing a threat designed to operate at the speed of kinetic events rather than diplomatic cycles. Consider how modern maritime tracking systems function as sensors within this global network. Data flows continuously from automatic identification systems on vessels, satellite feeds, and commercial intelligence platforms. In normal conditions, this creates a rich picture of shipping lanes and trade volumes. However, during a potential closure event, the sheer volume of redundant data acts like noise in an electronic circuit. The signal-to-noise ratio drops so low that diplomatic decision loops become paralyzed by the very information meant to clarify the situation. This is not just about having too much data, it is about how different systems process risk and uncertainty. A G7 consensus requires a specific threshold of agreement before financial sanctions or military deployment can be authorized. This creates a high-latency response time that an adversary with asymmetric capabilities does not need to match. They do not need to convince anyone to act. They simply need to execute a single, low-cost kinetic trigger like deploying mines or launching drone swarms against commercial traffic. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. The strategic choice here exploits a fundamental trade-off in global energy logistics. Rerouting oil and gas shipments away from the Strait of Hormuz requires vessels to travel thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope instead. This adds weeks to transit times and doubles fuel costs for every shipment involved. For high-value energy cargo, this latency is not just an inconvenience, it is a systemic failure that cannot be patched by diplomatic statements or financial coordination meetings in Geneva or Washington. This dynamic creates what engineers would call a fail-closed system where the cost of failure becomes asymmetrically distributed between the parties. The G7 faces economic collapse if energy flows stop, while the aggressor facing closure risks only localized military engagement. This asymmetry makes traditional diplomatic consensus a non-viable architectural pattern for crisis resolution because it assumes all actors have equal stakes in maintaining status quo stability. In reality, one side benefits from instability to achieve strategic leverage that diplomacy cannot undo. Now consider how this plays out over time rather than as a single event. The framing of the situation as a temporary crisis is actually a legacy software pattern designed for solvable bugs with clear endpoints. When you treat a closure as something to be solved by consensus, you ignore the fact that it functions more like a feature of the geopolitical system itself. The coordination overhead required for G7 states to align their positions exceeds the speed at which an asymmetric actor can execute and maintain physical disruption on the water. The economic warning systems currently in place function as noisy sensors rather than reliable alarms because they are calibrated for linear threats, not non-linear disruptions. When a minefield is laid or a drone swarm attacks tankers, the data streams continue to show traffic attempting to pass through until it physically cannot. By that point, diplomatic channels have already consumed weeks of bandwidth trying to reach agreement on what constitutes an act of war versus a criminal incident. The window for effective intervention closes before the consensus mechanism even reaches its quorum threshold. This is why the G7's financial coordination appears so ineffective when viewed through the lens of asymmetric deterrence. Their tools are designed for optimizing existing flows, not creating new ones under duress. They can sanction banks or freeze assets, but they cannot reroute a supertanker that has already been blocked by physical obstacles in international waters. The inability to solve this problem at the physical layer renders all their financial modeling theoretical exercises with no real-time application when it matters most. The core insight here is that consensus-based diplomacy cannot outpace kinetic asymmetric warfare because the two operate on completely different timescales and cost structures. One side moves fast and cheaply through decentralized triggers, while the other moves slowly and expensively through centralized approval chains. This mismatch means that every attempt to solve a closure as a diplomatic problem actually reinforces its persistence by treating it as an anomaly rather than a strategic feature of modern geopolitical competition. We see this pattern repeat across history whenever one side holds a choke point advantage over a coalition dependent on open access. The difference today is the speed at which information travels and how that same speed creates paralysis through overload. The G7's warning systems are overwhelmed by their own success in digitizing global trade, creating a situation where they know everything about the threat but can do nothing about it fast enough to prevent economic damage. This structural incompatibility explains why finance ministers meeting this week will likely produce statements of concern without changing anything on the water or in the markets. The closure remains possible because the incentives are misaligned and the response mechanisms are too slow for the speed of modern asymmetric conflict. Until the architecture of crisis management changes to account for these asymmetries, diplomatic coordination will remain a theoretical optimization problem with no real-world solution when physical access is denied by force. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.